Hi, welcome to my lecture for Assignment 3. In Assignment 3, I've given you a couple of readings. One is from James Scott's Against the Grain, and the other is from Gerda Lerner's The Creation of Patriarchy. I'm going to tackle these two assignments, two sub-assignments in Assignment 3 in separate lectures. But as you'll see, both of these folks are concerned with the early state, and they're both concerned with the domestication of humans. So let me just quickly preview what Scott and Lerner are up to, and then I'm going to just focus on Scott. One thing you'll see is that both of them are interested in the domestication of humans. That's a key feature of what they're looking at. Both of them are interested in what I think we might be able to call a kind of domination relationship or despotic relationship. I think by looking at these folks, we can get clearer on our ideas and understanding of what we think domination or despotism comes to, insofar as we want to understand something morally important and particularly morally problematic. Now, one key difference between Scott and Lerner is Scott is interested in general in how some humans came to domesticate other humans. Lerner wants to focus on the domestication of one class of humans, women. And the idea is that something like patriarchy emerged in the early state, and she wants to explain how that happened. And one way to think about that is women were very early on treated a lot like livestock. They were domesticated like livestock are domesticated plants. Scott says something similar, and he says, look, the early state is closely associated with a kind of domestication by some people over others, and in fact, that's part of his explanation of why the early state came into existence. Okay, so let me focus on, with that out of the way, let me just drill down in this lecture to Scott's particular question, the question that he's tackling in his book Against the Grain. And then we're going to look at a lot of the material from his chapter 5, where he gets out sort of the guts of his answer to his question. Now, his question is, why did the early state come into existence? And that question, to contemporary ears, all us folks who live under states and were the descendants of many, many generations of people who have lived in states, that question is almost a surprising question. Like, well, that it's something that we just sort of assume people live in states. But in fact, that's actually a relatively recent way of living for humans. So let me just say a bit more about Scott's question, and we're going to put it in this historical, this much larger historical backdrop where living in states is a recent development. So here's how Scott opens his book. I didn't give you this page to read. You could find it on Avenue. You could find it in the library, because Against the Grain is something that's accessible through our e-resources in the library if you wanted to. But I thought it was useful for this discussion and for our understanding of Chapter 5 if I just brought out a little bit of what Scott says about what he's up to. He looks at this, this deep background, this deep history, and he notes, like right off the bat, he knows that Homo sapiens actually haven't been living in states for very long. He asks, how did Homo sapiens sapiens, that's us, come so very recently in its species history to live in crowded, sedentary communities, packed with domesticated livestock and a handful of cereal grains, governed by the ancestors of what we now call states? This novel ecological and social complex became the template from virtually all of our species' recorded history. So this was the template for virtually all of our species' recorded history living under a state. But it isn't something that is a template for human existence in general, because for a very long time, as I'll recount in a bit, we didn't live in this way. So his question is going to be, look, for a very long time, we didn't live in states. And then now we've lived in states of a particular kind from about 3000 BC until, well, the Industrial Revolution. We lived in a state that was organized around a core agricultural production and livestock production, where we were basically producers of these things to eat and consume. And that was like the core enterprise of the state. And then there was the state that governed this enterprise. And his question is, how did Homo sapiens come to live in that kind of organization, in these grain states, as you might call them? Let me just back up for just a bit, and just repeat something I said in the last lecture, just so we have it firmly in mind. We should get clear on what we mean when we talk about a state. And for the purposes of this discussion, and probably others as well, but certainly for this discussion, I think we should hone in on one key feature of the states. Now, this isn't necessarily an exhaustive description of what a state is, but here's something that is a distinctive feature of states. I think that's important for the purposes of this discussion. Namely, states are institutions with the capacity to exert, through organized collective enforcement actions, the abiding and systematic control of the behavior of a governed population. And this capacity doesn't need to be unlimited. It's not like the state needs to be able to control every single thing everyone does in the state, but it has to range over a significant range of important forms of behavior of the governed group, such as it has to be able to, structure and order the way we organize joint productive activities and defense efforts. It has to be able to systematically control how we distribute the fruits of these joint efforts. Who gets what part of the surplus that we generate when we work in cooperation in this way. But the idea is that the state has this ability to control, the systematic ability to control, in an organized and collective way, where, say, legal officials, things like sheriffs and police and courts, can impose a set of rules on a community. Okay. Now, so then our question then is, how is it that Homo sapiens sapiens went from one way of living to this other way of living under these grain states, as it were, back in 3100 BC? Why did we start doing that? Now, Scott considers this kind of a traditional answer, just to set it aside. The traditional answer, as Scott says, he says, the narrative of this process has typically been told as one of progress, of civilization and public order, and of increasing health and leisure. He says that on page 1. Page 7, he kind of fills out some of the details. The idea in this traditional account is that once crops and sedentism, that is, a community living in one place, which the crops make possible, once crops and sedentism, the technological and demographic requirements, respectively, for state formation were established, states and empires would immediately arise as the logical and most efficient units of political order. So I think the general idea, the traditional account just says, look, people started living in states because they could see the appeal of living in states. It was better for them. They did better under states. It was a better way of living than the prior way of living. This just was an increase. This was a kind of progress for humanity and civilization and public order. People, of course, wanted to live in these things. It was better for everybody. Now, what Scott does in this book, the purpose of the book is to call that narrative into question on the basis of his reading of the advances in archaeological and historical research over the past 2 decades. So what Scott's doing is he's not trying to argue for the way things ought to be. He's given an account that's supposed to be a kind of scientific account. He wants to give an explanation of why. Why did people start living in this particular form of organization, this grain state, as it were? So to kind of motivate this question a bit more and to kind of see where he's coming from, I think it helps to trot out some of the deep background that he provides for us very early on in his book. So just let me read from him again. He notes that Homo sapiens appeared as a subspecies about 200,000 years ago, and we are found outside of Africa in the Levant no more than about 60,000 years ago. Then he notes the first evidence of cultivated plants and of sedentary communities appears roughly 12,000 years ago. So about 10,000 BC, thereabouts, that's when it looks like humans have figured out how to begin to cultivate and maybe even domesticate plants. And, given that ability to live in sedentary communities, like to kind of stay put rather than wander around looking for food. and then he notes that until that point, until about 10,000 years ago, that is to say, for 95% of the human experience on Earth, we lived in small, mobile, dispersed, relatively egalitarian hunting and gathering bands. So from about 200,000 to at least 10,000 BC, we did not live in grain states. We lived as hunter-gatherers, where we didn't cultivate crops and livestock that we had domesticated. Rather, we just lived off the land, and we hunted and we gathered food to save, and some of that food we could gather and kind of store up. But we didn't. But the focus was not on cultivation. Rather, we would just move in a nomadic sort of way from place to place to wherever the food was to be found. Okay. Uh, a little bit more background. I think it locates this in a more fine-tuned way. So there's a distinction between when humans started cultivating plants and living in some sedentary communities, but then it wasn't until about 3100 BC that we started living in these small, stratified tax collecting walled states, these grain states. These pop up in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley about 3,000 years BC, and that's about 4,000 years after we first figured out how to domesticate crops and how to live in settled communities. So what's so what Scott is doing here with these facts is he's raising a kind of challenge to the standard narrative. So remember, what the standard narrative about the state is that the appeal of the state form is obvious to those who have the technological means, domesticated crops and plow agriculture, to create and sustain it. But Scott's going to say, wait, that doesn't seem right, because there's about a 6,000 or 7,000 year gap in time between the emergence of these technologies, the plow agriculture, the ability to raise crops, and the emergence of the early states. So it doesn't look like living under a state, and remember, the state is this organized, stratified collective that's able to enforce the rules on everybody else. It doesn't look like living under a state is just the natural order of things once we are able to move out of that hunter-gatherer state. So we need something else to explain. Why is it that we did that? And then here's another thing, I think another element that challenges this standard narrative. And this is a thing that we see in chapter 5, and you certainly see throughout the book against the state. Hunter-gatherers like being hunter-gatherers in general. Chapter 5 illustrates in depth that so long as the hunter-gatherer life remained a live option for people, the early states had to take steps to make sure that people did not escape to that life and out from under the rule of the state. And so we've got to ask, look, if the state marks progress and the next step for humanity, for human development, well, if that's the better way for humans to be, why did these early states have to go to such great length to keep their population in place? Why was it that whenever possible these folks would try to get out of that form of life and to some other form of life? Why would they? Why do they feel the call of being a hunter-gatherer? Anyway, you can check out pages 152 to 153 and 162 to see if I'm reporting what Scott says there correctly. But it seems like that's a big part of it, and that seems to, cast some doubt on this standard narrative. Okay, now, what is Scott's answer to this question? And I'm just going to go straight to his punchline, and I'm actually going to skip quite a bit of the really interesting marshaling of various bits of evidence for this answer. But I just want to go to the answer. I'm going to leave it for you to read the evidence and see how it supports this claim. But let me just read what I take to be some quotes that uh, embody or recapitulate his punchline. So on page 151, Scott says, the means by which a population is assembled and then made to produce a surplus is less important in this context than the fact that it does produce a surplus available to non-producing elites. Such a surplus does not exist until the embryonic state creates it. And then next page, the next thing that I think is relevant to his answer. I'm going to sum all this up and tell you like how this amounts to his answer here in a second, but let me just read it first. The pertinent point for our purposes is that a peasantry, assuming that it has enough to meet its basic needs, will not automatically produce a surplus that elites might appropriate, but must be compelled to produce it. Under the demographic conditions of early state formation, when the means of traditional production were still plentiful and not monopolized, only through one form or another of unfree coerced labor, corvée labor, forced delivery of grain or other products, debt bondage, serfdom, communal bondage, and tribute, and various forms of slavery, was a surplus brought into being. Okay, so from this, I think we can extract his answer to his question. The idea seems to be that states came into existence only through the agency of non-producing elites. These non-producing elites were the folks who benefited from the states and this state form of production. These non-producing elites had an interest in holding folks in place to work agricultural lands to produce a surplus. I'm going to say a little bit more in a bit about what a surplus is. A surplus of goods. And they did this because they wanted the surplus. For whatever reasons, these elites want this surplus. And the only way to get it is through this kind of agricultural grain-based state production governed under a state, where the state both holds the people in place and gets them to work. Oh, and I should add too, distributes the fruits of the labor of most of the people in the state to the non-producing elites. So the idea is that the states come into existence. A key part of the explanation of why they come into existence is the agency of non-producing elites who want a surplus that they can only get through this form of organization. And once they figure out how to do this, they do it in their own interests. And here's the key part, and here's where the domination piece fits in, at the expense and against the wishes of the bulk of the population. The peasantry that would rather go back to its hunter-gatherer life or its pastoral life, if at all possible. Let me say just a little bit more, just to be a little bit clear. Scott uses this word surplus. There's this idea that the state exists through the agency of elites who want a surplus. And for right now, I think a rough definition that'll work for us is something like a surplus is goods produced by some group in addition to those needed to meet the group's basic essential needs. So one thing that you see in Scott's discussion is that, by and large, what humans will do is if it's possible, they will produce and work only insofar as doing so is required to meet their basic needs, and then they'll trade off any further production of goods for leisure time. He has several places where he seems to claim that that's just a basic tendency. And so the idea is that the surplus is this thing, it's this production beyond the amount of goods needed to just basically meet these essential needs of the population, something beyond that. And the idea is that the elite is seeking, the elite doesn't want to work to get those surplus goods because they're like anyone else. Like everyone else, humans are just basically naturally lazy. We don't want to labor to get the surplus goods. We'll just labor until the point that we that up until the point where we've satisfied these basic needs, but they still want them. And if they can figure out a way to get them by making something else provide them for them, say other humans, they will do that. Okay, so there's I think I've given you Scott's basic answer. Chapter to his question, why do we organize into states? Chapter 5 is basically what he basically does is he enumerates these various ways how that one set of persons dominated and forced another set of persons to perform this this surplus producing labor. He does it for China, he does it for Egypt. He points out all these different places and points in time where people are doing it and how they do it. And then he enumerates a whole bunch of different ways that they get this forced labor. There's corvée labor, there's forced delivery of grain, there's tribute, there's debt bondage, there's serfdom, communal bondage, all these things, different ways, but it's basically doing the same thing. It's this state-controlled and driven production of surplus goods, forced production of surplus goods on behalf of non-producing elites, or lazy elites. Okay, let me add a bit more texture to Scott's story here about how the early states came to be. And it's his idea of domestication, which he spells out in terms of Aristotle's idea of slaves as human tools. So Scott references Aristotle and Aristotle's general thought that a slave is a tool for work and as such to be considered as a domestic animal as an ox might be. Now Scott wants to run with this idea that he wants to take this notion, this concept of domestication, just in the way Aristotle does, and apply it to humans. But he wants to say, look, I think he wants to claim that this is really more than a metaphor. It actually is a pretty accurate description of what happened in these early states. So just a few selective quotes from Scott to bring this point out. The captives, the forced laborers, individually and collectively, became an integral part of the state's means of production and reproduction, a part, if you will, along with the livestock and grain fields of the state's own domus. The domus is this whole little complex, the officials governing production over this domesticated set of property. There's grain and livestock being produced, and it's all pretty close in geographic proximity. Okay. So the captives individually and collectively became an integral part of the state's means of production and reproduction, a part, if you will, along with the livestock and grain fields of the state's own domus. At the very center of domestication, so here he's saying something key about this idea of domestication. At the very center of domestication is the assertion of human control over the plants or animals' reproduction, which entails confinement and a concern for the selective breeding and rates of reproduction. So he's saying, look, folks who know a lot about domestication, what it is, what they point out is when you domesticate something like a grain or a corn plant, you do this over time, and what you do is or maybe like an ox or a cow, you assert human control over that plant or animal, and you assert control over its ability to reproduce itself as something that produces more of the valuable good. And to do that, you have to confine the thing, and then you breed the thing, and you kind of monitor its reproduction, and you tend to it, you shepherd it, you kind of keep it in place so that you can exploit it. His idea is that that's basically what people did to themselves. And he suggests, and he says this is speculative, but he could kind of see how this would work, that people sort of figured out, hey, wait, that thing that we did to all these big animals and the thing that we did to all the plants, we can do this to other people too, and we can get them to work for us. And just like the animals, by domesticating them, that can kind of ease our laboring burden. Maybe that's probably even more true if we can do that to people. But then the question is, how can we domesticate them? How can we confine them? How can we make them work for us? And that's where you need the state. And once you figure out how to put this state in place, this overweening collective control agency in place, people are going to want to do that because they're going to want to exploit others. So those others will produce this surplus for them. So finally, as Scott says on page 181, this last little quote from Scott, the domesticated plow animal or beast of burden lifts much of the drudgery from a man's back. Much the same could obviously be said for slaves, and also for corvée labor, indentured servants, serfs, all these different ways that Scott enumerates that one set of persons is able to hold in place and force the productive activity of others. Okay. Now let me return all this, this whole discussion, I think, to the course themes. I think what Scott has given us is he's giving us a textured account of the emergence of domination relationships amongst humans. So the idea is that humanity goes from this state where we're a bunch of hunter-gatherers who basically live off of these resources in common, and we kind of move around and live off those things, produce off those things, and we none of us. It's very hard for us to control one another, and so we all sort of follow our natural tendency just to labor and produce up until the point that we satisfy our most basic needs, and after that we trade off any further production or any further surplus value for the leisure and for the ease of life that we can have. Our basic needs are met, and then we kind of just leave it at that. And Scott notes that, look, that was the equilibrium condition for humanity for a very long time. And then his idea is that at some point, humans figure out how to domesticate other humans. They figure out how to, I think, to use a term that seems appropriate from the earlier discussions, we figure out how to dominate others, in that we figure out how to organize in these collectives, these states, to where one small group of us, because we're organized in these collective enforcement entities, we're able to then dominate others, to labor, to produce a surplus that the dominating class, this bit of elites, that they get to consume. So the idea is that humans, they're always lazy. They never want to work any more than they need to satisfy their basic needs. And they're always looking for ways to satisfy their basic needs more easily. And then at some point in history, they figure out, oh, we can get other humans to work for us, not just other, say, plow animals to work for us. And then we can really very easily satisfy our basic needs, so long as we are able to continue to control them and control their efforts in service of our desire to have our needs met. And moreover, I think for Scott, his idea is that then you get something a little bit more, where now persons are going to want more than the amount of stuff necessary to satisfy their basic needs. They're also going to keep, riding this machine or, exploiting this machine to satisfy more than their basic needs. It's going to turn out they can get this machine to produce a surplus, and they want that too. They don't want just their basic needs satisfied. They want more than that. The reason they didn't go for more than that earlier in history is because it was, humans are basically lazy. It would be too much work. But it isn't so much work if you can set this dominating machine in place where one set of folks is able to force other folks to produce that surplus that the dominator consumes. So here we get a kind of relationship where one set of persons is able to force another set of persons to produce a surplus. This other set of persons, this laboring set of persons, this is key. They produce in service of the dominating class's interests, not their own. Because remember, those persons would not produce so much. They'd much rather trade off further work for the production of this surplus. Because, like most humans, will trade off surplus for leisure. They would trade off surplus for leisure if they could. So here we have a kind of relationship where one set of persons isn't merely controlling another set of persons. It is controlling them in a way that is not in their interests. And I think here I'm going to suggest, and we'll talk about this more, I think we're getting more elements on the table to give us a satisfying account of what a domination relationship is, or a despotic relationship is. It's this relationship in which one set of persons gets another set of persons to do something, and the doing of that thing really is not in that other sort of person's in that other set of persons' interests. Rather, it's in the dominator's interests. All right, and then Scott has this kind of very sad commentary on the origins of the state that says, well, basically, states came into being because people people are inclined to dominate in this way if they can, in order to get other people to create this surplus for them, and they want that surplus. The state exists essentially because we're disposed to dominate to get this surplus, if we can do it. And his idea is that around 3000 BC, people figured out how to do that. And then it turns out that that once you figure out how to do that and you get that machine going, then you have a very powerful and robust way of organizing things. Very good for the elites at the top, very bad for the folks at the bottom. But those elites can kind of keep that machine going for thousands of years, and that's exactly what they've done. Anyway, that's what I've got for Scott, and I will continue with the discussion of Lerner here in a bit. Thank you, folks.